Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and today I'm going to point out the hypocrisy of the Liberal Party in terms of its exercise of governance in Canada pertaining to its relations in failure to live up to obligations to Indigenous nations and their nationals. I want to point out is that, the Liberal Party, its representatives, and those speaking on liberalism sound so good, but if you to look at their actual practices, you can see exactly why I call them hypocrites and why I still see what's going on today as constituting, actions of an outlaw nation. The first paper I'm going to quote from was a deliberation, a famous speech delivered at the Academy of Music Quebec on the invitation of the Club Canadian, where Wilfrid Laurier spoke on June 26, 1877. It says, "The Liberal Party has been for 25 years in opposition, and let it remain there for 25 years more, if the people has not yet been educated up to accepting its ideas, but let it march proudly with its banners displayed in the full face of the country." It says, "The right of interference in politics finishes at the spot where it encroaches on the elector's independence. It is therefore perfectly legitimate to alter the elector's opinion by argument and all other means of persuasion, but never by intimidation. As a matter of fact, persuasion changes the elector's conviction. The opinion he expresses is his own opinion, but when, by terror, you force him to vote, the opinion he expresses is your opinion. Remove the cause of his fear, and he will then express another opinion, which is his own." Right now, Indigenous nations have been so squeezed. They have, their children have not been allocated equitable education, for example, or medical care. When Canada deemed Indigenous nationals to be Canadian citizens, Canada added an extra layer of responsibility. And that is that apart from treaties and the obligations under treaties, Canada now also made a commitment to equitably deal with them on the basis of all benefits that Canadians as a whole receive from their government. Now, Indigenous nationals didn't ask for that. They were deemed citizens, but Canada has consistently supported and failed to meet the duty of fairness that Canada is responsible for all Canadians. Canada does, transfer payments and sends money to different provinces, always trying to balance out the quality of life for Canadians as a whole. The intention with Indigenous nations is quite the opposite. Keep them in poverty, keep them not well, keep them unable to properly function, and turn their attention from, Maslow's hierarchies of needs. When you're hungry, and this is one thing that always dawned on me before, it's like, these are serious constitutional issues I talk about. But it wasn't until I was hungry, till I had literally no food in the house, that I realized, I don't really care about constitutional issues right now. What I care about is, what am I going to feed my son for dinner? And when I reached that conclusion and understanding and understood then, this is why so many people that I try to inform, and I'm going back 20 years now or so, so many people that I try to inform just don't seem to appreciate how serious this all is. Well, they're busy trying to feed their family. They're busy trying to find winter coats for their families before the harsh, winter hits. Of course, they're going to be focused on their immediate needs. This is why Canada consistently prefers a state of poverty, because just like when removing, buffalo, and I would argue even salmon through salmon farming, that you make people hungry and, they're going to come to the table. In fact, that's how many treaties were entered into. Crown needed to get permissions before exercising lawfully any partial political sovereignty over her own people, the Crown's own people. needed permissions of Indigenous nations. Well, it was only when Indigenous nations were literally starved did many of them come to the table and say, okay, we'll grant you some permissions in exchange, you help us survive. So, it's no different than what, this liberal, he's a well-known liberal, is saying. Like, you're just forcing, you're forcing an outcome. And that, of course, triggers all sorts of things like tarnishing the honor of the crown as well. The next document I'm referencing is the speech, Lester Pearson's Nobel Peace Prize lecture that was delivered at Oslo on December 11, 1957. And he was granted that Peace Prize for his international diplomacy, organizing the UN emergency force to resolve the Suez Canal crisis in 1957. Now, Lester Pearson became prime minister for 2 liberal minority governments and was in that position from 1963 to 1968. So this is before he became prime minister. And he's talking about it's essential to, quote, recognize the right of people to choose their own form of government without interference from outside forces or subversive domestic forces encouraged and assisted from without. I recognize that contact can mean friction as well as friendship. That ignorance can be malevolent and isolation pacific. But I can find nothing to say for keeping one people malevolently misinformed about others. More contact and freer communication can help to correct this situation. To encourage it, or at least to permit it, is an acid test for the sincerity of protestations for better relations between peoples. And he goes on to offer the Russian example, because of course Cold War at the time. I believe also, I believe myself that the Russian people, to cite one example, wish for peace. I believe also that many of them think that Americans are threatening them with war, that they are in danger of attack. So might I, if I had as little chance to get objective and balanced information about what is going on in the United States. Similarly, our Western fears of the Soviet Union have been partially based on a lack of understanding or of information about the people of that country. Misunderstanding of this kind arising from ignorance breeds fear, and fear remains the greatest enemy of peace. I put it to you that this Canadian government of today is fostering fear. It is engaging in negotiations, nefarious negotiations, that are kept secret and private, and Indigenous nationals who remain the decision makers are not informed in the least, have no knowledge of what is going on at these tables, and furthermore, have not said and given permission to anyone to represent them at these tables. You have chiefs at these tables that are self-selected. They're members of federal boards. I could go on. But the point is, such hypocrisy, right? Sharing and communicating of information. Instead, in order to make these things try to work, Canada has to do it in secrecy. Canada has to issue bribes, has to dangle with First Nations Land Management Act. Things like, okay, sign off, chief. Get the people to vote. Just call it, don't call it a land code. Call it something that looks like it's under your own laws. They'll think you're exercising self-government. And what we'll do is give you all of the trust monies. All the capital and revenue trust monies that are sitting in Ottawa, we'll put it into your hands, Chief and Council. We'll deposit it in your account. How are the Indigenous nationals then going to ensure that their collective assets are protected? It's shown time and time again that they can't. There's multiple millions of dollars missing from many communities where people are still congregated and having to live You know, and it's so important to understand how dangerous this is now, with us, you know, being in quarantine situation. How many, I had no idea even, and I've been around a lot, how many are forced to live in one single household, in one home. The numbers are ridiculous. And so, you know, if something, litmus test, you know, as this great Liberal member, former Prime Minister said, you know, litmus test is, you know, what's the level of communication understanding? Be upfront. Well, Canada cannot be upfront, right? Because if Canada were to disclose what they're actually doing, which is what I am disclosing, they were actually say, yeah, actually, this is a capitulation. You will no longer, you're saying here you're not a nation. You're saying you're only and always have been part of Canada at some point. And in 1982, we kind of cemented that somehow. And I won't repeat myself because I've said this a number of times. So I just want to point out the great hypocrisy. This Liberal government, in terms of its dealings with Indigenous nations, continues to operate on the basic function and belief system that they don't deserve to have this land, that they don't deserve to be in control. They don't deserve to make their own decisions. Why? What does it come down to? Why? Because they don't look like us, because they don't practice our religion for the most part. These are foundations that we need to get rid of immediately in Canada, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. And what concerns me is that all of these agreements being entered into, which in no way can be upheld as binding on the nations, when that next generation does understand what Canada was trying to do and does understand how the manipulations happened, do you think we're going to have a peaceful country at that time? Look at what happened just recently before the quarantine with so many disruptions of commerce, you know, because of all the railways and all the roads that they put through reserves, which, you know, it was, you know, in hindsight, oh, let's take their land. Not so smart, was it? But anyhow, my point is, if you think they're angry then, what's going to happen when the next generation is fully functioning, does not have such a high proportion of illness and FAC and drug and alcohol addictions and all of the coping mechanisms, because there is a lack of support for the, you know, the generational trauma they've been through. Once, you know, and because it's already happening, right? There's a lot of people empowering their people, and it's a good thing to report on, and I'm happy to see it, and I know of many examples. So Canada, you need to think about that. You may, yes, think you can get this all done now, but you can't, because it's not lawful. Those are the actions of an outlaw nation. You have treaties. You've already recognized, the Crown has recognized that these nations exist. In Canada, you can't do this. You can't destroy them. It's not within your power or jurisdiction. That's all I have to say.